Welcome to another episode of Wisdom Personified, Conversations with Dudu Msomi. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. I hope you have found it very valuable and that you have had reflective moments in terms of how it's impacting your life. And I am so excited today. You know how I'm always excited. Nozipho Mbanjwa is somebody that I don't hang out with, but I have been observing from afar. So this is the new generation of what I call wise people. I hope you'll find the same essence that I see in her. Nozipho, how are you?
I'm fantastic. What a beautiful introduction. A new generation of wise people. Thank you.
I really see you as that. And thank you, because you got such a hectic schedule and you gave us time. So that's amazing. Can I say congratulations for the latest?
Yes, you can.
Congratulations on your engagement.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm floored by it. I mean, the love has been from every corner, globally even, it has just been amazing. And so, yeah, I'm transitioning into this another form of self and trying to figure out what being a wife means. And so that's a journey I'm looking forward to.
I think you got a great role model in your mother. So this is going to be great. So this is perfect to ask you, what was your upbringing like? Do you have any siblings? You know, what are your treasured memories?
So I have an interesting configuration of a family. I'm the eldest of 3 girls. But both my mom and my dad had a child each before they married. So I have an older sister and I have an older brother. Older sister from my mom and an older brother from my dad. But we grew up as me and my 2 sisters. And later on in life, you know, the family kind of sort of said, no, but we're bigger than what we are. So now I find myself with 4 siblings and having to transition from thinking I've been the eldest all my life to a middle child.
The middle child syndrome.
I kind of feel like I'm a middle child with firstborn tendencies for the most part. But I do have siblings. And my childhood was, you know, when I think about it, it was actually very stable. So one of the gifts that my parents gave me and my siblings was the gift of stability. Before my mom passed away about 2 years ago, they had been married for 37 years. And, you know, even though, like many Black South Africans born in the 80s like me, we all have our stories of, you know, being born into poverty, being raised through poverty and so on. The one thing we never lacked was family. And so even today, you know, my fiance always says to me, one of the biggest gifts you've given me is the gift of family. I watch your family in a way that I've never seen your family before. Yeah. And that's because that's all I've ever known. My mother was what we call an anchor, not only within our family, but within the community. And so our house was always filled with people, cousins, aunts, community members. She was always taking somebody's child through school. She was always, we were always being raised with other children within the family. So, you know, I have biological siblings, but I have so many brothers and sisters because of who she is and was. And so my childhood really, I think the best way to describe it would be very anchored in family and stability. My fondest memory, though, my dad used to smoke many years ago. He gave it up, I think, about 20 years ago.
Thank goodness. He became enlightened.
He became enlightened. But before that, I used to remember as a child, I'd climb up onto his lap and he would be smoking Rothmans. And I used to watch the curly-whirly things go up. And it was always the smell of Rothmans and the news on the radio in the background. And those were our special moments together. So I grew up also a little bit like a daddy's girl. And my mom and I were very much like each other. We're 2 peas in a pod, and because of that, I think we also had a very tumultuous relationship because we just are the same person.
It's always amazing in dynamics of families, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're a conversation strategist, and I know a lot of people are going to be very curious as to what that is. For the people that are not familiar with that expertise, can you explain what you do?
I know when I put it in simple terms, I always say that my job is about helping smart people have simple conversations that make the world a better place. And I stumbled on it, and I actually came up with the term conversation strategist because actually there wasn't a blueprint or a list of a profession for me to say, oh, that's what it is. I had to stop and reflect and think, what is it that I'm actually doing? And so practically what it looks like is that I get invited by governments, by international organizations, and by businesses around the world to come and use the science of conversation to unlock strategy, to unlock policy, to be the bridge between the idea and the execution. And the only thing that actually enables that bridge and creates that dot connect between idea and execution is the conversation. It's about framing the questions that help us move to breakthrough thinking so that we can actually begin to implement. So I would moderate conversations that have impact on the world. So for example, the International Labour Organization is one of my big clients, and one of the big conversations that I've been helping the ILO have over the past 5 years or so is how do we ensure that the global labor market produces decent jobs for the billions of people in the world? How do we ensure that in 2020 we can say that we no longer, by the way, have 280 million people working in poverty, so they're employed, but they're still part of the working poor.
Yeah.
It's 280 million people in the world.
That's a lot.
And we have to translate the aspiration of wanting to get rid of this number into execution in different national policies around the world. So that's what I would do for governments and international organizations. And then for corporates, so it's interesting, I get called in almost like a secret weapon.
Yeah.
So it would be, you don't have to tell everybody that you're coming. It's just the top executive team or the global team, and they'll put the strategy in front of me and they'll say, how do we use the strategy so that it ignites the person that has to execute it at the ground level? So we begin to almost like unpack it and say, how would we land this so that the teams that have to deliver on this connect with the why, connect with the what, connect with the how. And so we begin to deconstruct strategy using the science of conversation. Now, when I went to university, there wasn't anything in the prospectus that described
what
this,
you're doing,
right? And so when people kept on asking me, what do you do? I actually realized it is the convergence of strategy and conversation, and hence I'm a conversation strategist.
And people have a misunderstanding because the minute you are doing that, they like you're an MC or a program director.
Oh, yeah.
Which is exactly why I thought I'll ask. So you clarified that there is a difference.
And you know, it's such a brilliant question, and it's actually what I found is that it's a South African misunderstanding, if you will. The rest of the world seems to have figured out that there's different roles. In South Africa, we have, MCs, program directors, presenters, and then we have moderators, facilitators as well. But there is this idea of just a convergence of these roles. And until we take the time to actually educate the market, you almost cannot blame the market for thinking that. And so one has to be very deliberate about articulating and framing what it is that you're doing. So when I get a client who comes to me and says, Nozipho, won't you please MC? I take the time to say, let me help you understand why what I do is not MCing. And if you do want an MC, I can refer you to an MC, because there is a place and a role and there's value, but that is just not what I do.
Interestingly enough, you were on one of our main business channels and you left that. Did you not fear that not having that platform will reduce your visibility in the market?
I definitely did. It was a real fear, but the transition was just, it was calling me and it was so strong. I realized that the platform was continental. It gave me, such a great exposure. But I knew that the impact that I could have outside of the studio and outside of one particular platform, to not report on the conversation, but to actually shape the conversation, that idea was so far more attractive. And so I took the risk and I took the jump, and it wasn't an easy one. And I remember the day it clicked was I was actually having a conversation with someone, and I was relaying this very fear, and he said to me, so let me understand this. can you just articulate to me clearly, what is the thing that you're most afraid of? What is the boogeyman in this equation? So I said, actually, well, the boogeyman is January, December, and April.
Yeah.
Because whether you're a moderator or conversation strategist, in January, December, and April, nobody's actually looking for your services. And then he turned around and he says, well, that's 3 out of 12 months.
Yeah.
Are you telling me that you can't do enough work in the 9 months that actually you don't even bother working in those 3 months and you just take them off as a holiday?
And you choose not to.
And you choose not to work anyway in those 3 months. And I remember just thinking, of course, I've got 9 months out of 3. And it's been absolutely phenomenal. You know, the beautiful thing about the relationship with the platform is they are now a client of mine, so we've been able to retain the relationship. But if you ever have that fear of, can I jump? Can I go into the entrepreneurial space? You have to name your boogeyman.
Yes.
And until you name your boogeyman, you're probably going to be harboring a fear that actually doesn't exist, and a fear that's not as big as you're making it out to be.
Yeah. I always say, imagine the worst. So, okay, you take that jump.
Yeah.
And you lose it all. Is what you're wanting to do worth it?
Exactly.
And if it is, go ahead, because you're never going to fail. Because you're going to make sure you don't fail.
Exactly.
You know? Do you think you're studying political economy and development finance adds some edge to you being a moderator, especially of global conversations?
Absolutely. So my academic journey, I'll be the first to admit that I didn't have it all planned out. It was kind of like haphazard. So my first degree was in political science at the University of Pretoria. I chose political science because, second to law, it was the cheapest program in the perspective at the University of Pretoria. That was the only reason why I studied political science. And in my heart, I thought, it's fine. I really know I'm good at speaking. Maybe I'll go into politics with it. And I had this idea that I'm going to be an ambassador and that's going to be fine. I then moved, I had an opportunity to do my first master's at SOAS at the University of London. And there I focused on international studies and diplomacy. And so quite interestingly, my world started opening up, you know, not only because I was studying in the UK, but what I was studying, you know, global economics. I was studying international law. I was beginning to look at the politics of Africa in relation to the politics of Asia, as an example. Worked in between, came back to South Africa and decided I was going to do a second master's. And that's when I started doing a master's in development finance. Those 3 things have stood me in such good stead. Yeah. From a finance perspective, it's helped me to be able to frame the questions that allow us to have a conversation that moves us beyond the periphery and beyond the surface. Because I understand integrally the principles of the financial instruments that we have on the continent that we could leverage for development. And that development conversation can be extrapolated into any other part of the world outside Africa. The thing I rely on the most, funnily enough, is actually my training as a diplomat in London. Yeah. Because the work that I do is actually diplomacy. It's really about getting different voices to converge around a single vision, and each of them to bring their relative strengths to get the job done. And that's what diplomats do.
You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking you are very rich in terms of your thought process and the person you are. Are you able to crystallize what your unique value proposition is? If you are not here tomorrow, what will we miss?
If I was not here tomorrow, the world will miss an African voice that drives global conversation with depth, breadth, and intellect. That's it. That's what I do. I am unapologetically African first and foremost. I don't care for being South African. I am a child of the continent, first and foremost. I am intentional about going to the world and not only being an African voice that is shaping global conversation, but being an African on those stages to say, actually, beyond just me, I'm going to bring insights and lenses and coloring and nuances to the conversation that make sure that this continent is not a periphery in the conversation, as it so often happens. And my commitment to the work that I do is for example, nobody writes my questions, nobody does my research, because I don't believe that you can get depth and breadth by reading something that somebody else has prepared for you. So at the core of everything that I do is that I bring intellect because I bring academia and research into the process of producing what we then see on stage. As you would appreciate, what is on stage is 10%.
Yeah.
90% of the work is how much you are committed to the process of sitting in the problem of the research that you've got to actually surface insights.
Yeah.
And you know, I always say, people will say to me, oh, how can you speak about all these subjects? One day you're speaking about ICT, the next day you're speaking about the pharmaceutical industry. And I say, well, actually, I don't have to be an expert in all of those industries. I need to be an expert in asking the right questions that move the conversation forward. And so my process of researching is about committing to surfacing the questions that move the conversation and make the conversation consequential.
Yeah.
Because the minute you and I are having a conversation for sake of conversation's sake,
Yeah.
then I've not done my job. But if I'm raising and surfacing questions that make the outcome of the conversation consequential, then I've done my job. And I always say that not every conversation is going to end with a beautiful answer to the
Yeah.
question that I've raised. The most impactful conversations are the ones that I leave with more questions.
Yeah, I must say, you know, the preparation that it takes to do that, it's very difficult to price.
Yeah.
Because people don't, because I do bespoke
Yeah.
work, and sometimes I have to change it the very next minute.
Exactly.
Because I've seen something in the group or the leadership team that I'm working with. I'm
Yes.
like, this is not going to land. I have to go back and change. How did you get to understand how to price yourself?
It's a very difficult journey, and I think it's a brilliant question. I mean, I still get people today who call me up and say, I want to do what you do. What do you charge? And I think, my goodness, it's actually, I don't have a series of products that are sitting on the shelf. I literally, you know, when the client reaches out to me, you know, I apply this thing called jobs theory, which is coming back to this idea of understanding what is the job that we want this conversation to do. And so I'll sit with the client to unpack and to uncover the job. And once we have gotten to a point where we understand what it is that we want this conversation to do, I then go back and I say, okay, from a time perspective, what is the input from a time and research perspective that's going to get us to get this job done? And then I'll come back and say, this is the rate for this piece of work.
Yeah.
And I've been very blessed to have repeat clients who now understand
Yes.
that we don't have products on
Yeah.
the shelf, and every single piece of engagement is going to be very different. And when you say to people, no, I actually don't have a rate card, they think you are hoarding
Cagey,
your
precisely. But also, it's also what has created you, the information, the education. You have prepared yourself to be able to engage in that field.
Yeah.
So people forget that you know, you may have a different qualification.
Yeah.
You may do different types of prep, and you're gonna have a different product because
Yeah.
of the way you are. But if you had more money than Oprah and did not need to ever work to make a living, how would you spend your days?
Whether I had more money than Oprah or if I had no money at all, and I had no responsibilities in the world, I know the one thing that I would do, I'd teach.
Which you're still doing in a way, isn't it?
In
Yeah.
a way. I have a deep love for the profession of teaching. There's something that you get when you see somebody's light come on.
Yeah.
Because you've been able to break down the idea into simplistic forms,
Yeah.
and they get it.
It is a high.
It's a definite high, and I've dabbled a little bit in it. I've had a very brief stint at the University of Pretoria as a junior lecturer. I do guest lecturers on invitation from time to time, but I really think that's what I do.
And you can still do it. You will still do in between your hectic schedule.
I'm getting another job here.
Yeah, we shall talk. What's the most courageous decision you've ever taken in your life so far? And what drove you to that decision?
I think my most courageous decision was actually taking a jump from, I was working for a corporate. I was very young. I was about 26. I had a big title. I was the head of corporate communications and branding for Africa. I had 13 African countries that I was looking after. And then the media platform that we're speaking about came knocking on my door and said, hey, we think we'd love to have you join us. And we got into the conversation, and I looked at the comparatively where I was and where I was going. And the financial package from the media platform was less than half of what I was currently earning.
I know that.
And you can imagine, as a young person, you think you are on an ascent. You're finally on the ladder, and now it's just a couple of rungs, systematically. And I remember just thinking to myself, Noz, what does your heart want? And just coming to the realization that actually, you know what, I don't have to drive the car that I'm driving. I can take this back. I can move into a smaller place. I did move. I moved into a smaller place. It made a big difference. So I didn't actually have to get rid of my car, but I did fundamentally change my lifestyle because I thought, I want to give this a shot. I really want to see what it's like. And I think if I hadn't, I might not be here today. That decision became such an important stepping stone to where I am today, and I do not for a moment regret giving it up. And so sometimes I think we are tied by golden handcuffs, and it takes courage to free yourself from them. And I think I was so grateful for the advice that I got from so many people who said to me, the stuff that you have is just the beginning. You can go back to the bottom, and you're still going to rise. And that's what I did.
And exceed where you were.
Yeah.
That is so key, because a lot of us are not doing what we love.
Yeah.
Because we're drinking the champagne. And it makes us so vulnerable, because you are miserable.
Exactly.
You have the most expensive car, you have an expensive house, but you are just miserable. You're not living your best life.
Exactly.
Are you living your best life?
I think God has been so good. God has been so good.
Pinch myself.
My fiance says to me, so my birthday is coming up. He's like, what do you want for your birthday? And I sat there and I was like, I don't know if I want anything.
I got it all.
I'm good. I'm good. I'm happy with the work that I do. I'm blessed with a partner that I love, respect, and admire in so many ways. My family is supportive. My in-laws are amazing. I've got a fantastic group of friends and a solid sisterhood around me. It doesn't mean that every day is a bed of roses, but on the net,
it is just
of all, at the end of the day, jeepers, God has been good. Hey, I'm living my best blessed life.
Okay, that's a new one. You spent some time in Washington, D.C. working with the mayor's office there.
Yes.
What insights, looking at our state of local government, can you give us in terms of what you learned that we could incorporate?
So when I was working in Mayor Fenty's office, I was part of an office called the Grants and Coordination Office, which was a subdivision in the mayor's office. And what we did was we would coordinate grants and donations and investments that were coming from the business community that were intended for the education sector in the Washington district. So businesses that wanted to invest in schools, that wanted to invest in school programs. And so it was actually quite focused to look at how do you create the incentives for business to want to participate in a public-private partnership, and how then also do the programs structure themselves in such a way that there is a clear return on the investment, both from a financial metric perspective, but also from the social returns. How do you leverage the stories, the narrative that comes from the people whose lives have changed to tell that story of the return of investment? And how do you track the investment of where the impact has actually had the impact on the children? And this landed for me when I actually started working at the Mlambo Foundation when I came back from DC. And the foundation was focused on rural schools and rural principals, and our job was to take the principals on a leadership journey that would shift their mindsets so they did not see themselves as just principals, but they saw themselves as CEOs of entities. So they had shareholders, they had returns, and I realized that one of the biggest mistakes that we were making in terms of how do we get the financial flow from business to these rural schools is that we have star rural schools. And everybody, for example, all the corporates and all the businesses go to the same school. So you have the maths and science program there, the leadership development program there, the feeding scheme program there, and so the food garden, everything that was happening there. And because of that, when there was an uptick in performance of the school, we had no way of measuring who did what and who was responsible for what. And so we just actually don't have a way of beginning to say there's nothing wrong with having different stakeholders contributing, but how do we firstly disseminate funding so that it actually reaches all the places it needs to, and for corporates to break away from this idea that they need to go to a rural school that's already performing so that they can latch on to,
because it's good PR.
It's good PR, whereas instead of going to a low base and go to a school that really needs it. And so PR can be dangerous.
Have you heard of the imposter syndrome?
Yes.
For those of you who don't know, it is defined as a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persists despite evidence of success. Do you suffer from it?
Absolutely.
And how do you handle that?
You know, I think the first thing is a consciousness around your imposter syndrome moments and when they creep up on you, because they creep up on you, you suddenly find yourself in a space that you didn't think that you would, you'd ever find yourself in. And just as you're getting your confidence, you get that tap on the shoulder that says, but do you really, really belong here? And I've just had to raise my consciousness in those moments. First reaction is to have the conversation with myself, like, Noz, what's actually happening here? Is this, are you really undeserving to be here? And if sometimes I can't get through it myself, because sometimes it's so strong, again, you need to surround yourself with people who are not only brutally honest with you, but who are there to help you snap out of these things. And so my go-to person has always been my partner, who's always saying to me, okay, let's not do a motivational speech. Let's just start from what are the steps that have gotten you here. And then as you begin looking at the work you've put in, the value that you've surfaced for others, how the invitation to have a seat at this particular table has come to be, you realize how silly this particular moment is. It's happened to me many times. The last time I think is when I got my first board position. And I remember thinking, Mina, sitting on boards? How? And just, really just being paralyzed. And here I was with a seat at the table that I'd earned. And I had to go back to somebody that I trusted. And this particular time it was a mentor who said, let's just have a moment to talk about what did they say they saw in you. Now, of each of these things that they've invited you on, which of these are not true? And that's how we invited Miss Imposter to step out of the room.
But also, I think we do forget that they have the privilege of your time and your services. We're always thinking we have the privilege. But your presence brings something of value as well.
But to frame that, sometimes we get caught up because the syndrome is so strong that you're unable to reframe what's actually happening. And so you really have to surround yourself, call it a trust circle. People who are going to ground you when you start getting a big head, because it does happen, but also who are going to be committed to validating you and reminding you of your worth and reminding you of why you deserve what God has blessed you with in every moment. And my circle of trust is everything. So imposter syndrome always comes, but I always have people who turn around to say, Noz, let's have a practical conversation about this.
That is very insightful, because I had somebody I dated years ago, And so whenever I felt insecure about exams or something, he was like, oh, but you always like do well. I'm like, I don't feel that way.
Yeah.
I don't take it for granted.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, you're thinking, well, she's always doing well. I'm like, no, this is not how I feel. So it's always good to have people who don't think like you just being a drama queen.
Exactly.
That you literally feel like I need that support at the moment.
Who understand that you're coming to them with a real fear.
Yeah.
What I write at the top of every sheet when I'm about to step onto a global stage is, don't laugh. But this is a lyric from a song between Mariah, Carey and Whitney Houston. And the lyric is, we were moving mountains long before we knew we could.
Yeah.
And I look at that and I think, gosh, my mother moved mountains, my grandmother moved mountains in their respective spaces, doing their respective things. This is just me facing and moving a mountain. And tomorrow, somebody else will face and move a mountain. It's okay.
Yeah.
I can do it, and I'm going to do it well. And I will have another mountain tomorrow, and I'll move that too. This is what we were born to do.
Yeah.
We are built for the win.
Yeah.
Just get on with it.
Just get on with it. We could talk the whole day, you know that. But in closing, what legacy do you want to leave behind?
When I think about what I want the world to remember me for when I'm gone, I want to have created an industry that before me actually didn't exist. I don't want to be the only conversation strategist in the world. I get messages and DMs and inboxes from young ladies who say, thank you, I now know what I'm doing, or I now know what I'm pursuing. I'm going to be a conversation strategist just like you. And my heart soars because I think before me this didn't exist, or in that particular framed way. And so this is part of the legacy that I'm building. I also want to be remembered for professionalizing this work. Yeah. You know, I think a lot of people who look at what I do and they're like, oh, she's a moderator, and then think that everybody can do that. And so they start doing it as a side hustle, which just makes my blood boil. And because of that, the profession of conversation isn't actually professionalized, because everybody thinks that they can do it, and so they have a main job and then they have this side hustle. And I'm going to set the example, if I have to, that this is a profession. It can be the core of your income generating activity, and it can be the thing that changes the world. You don't have to be both. You don't have to straddle being a journalist and a moderator. You don't have to straddle being part of business and a moderator, because once you do that, you're actually not giving the one thing conversation demands, which is absolute undivided attention. If you cannot give a conversation that, chances are you're not fully invested in it, and you actually don't understand the value of the voices around you. So this is a industry that I'm committed to building. This is an industry that I'm committed to professionalizing, and I'm going to normalize the idea of young black women from the continent shaping, driving, galvanizing global conversation. That's what I'm here to do.
And this is exactly why we are having this conversation. Because from a distance, I could see what you are trying to do. And when you left the public platform, I realized how committed you are. Because usually people have that public platform because they're so scared that without it, I don't have value.
Yeah.
And that's where my respect for you just shot up.
Thank you.
This is why we're having this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Wisdom Personified, Conversations with Dudu Msomi. Join us again, and please subscribe. I'm sure you're enjoying this journey. Keep going.